Hi there, and today we will talk about Sweden before, during, and after World War II. My name is Marcus Henriksson, and I'm a history teacher here in Sweden. In the 1930s, Sweden was now developing into a real industrial country for the first time. Sweden got electricity in the cities and villages, cars became more popular, we got buses, telephones, radios, etc. We also had a new prime minister here in Sweden, the man in the picture, Per Albin Hansson, who became the prime minister of Sweden in the year 1936. He started to construct things like schools, kindergartens, hospitals, care centers, roads, railroads, electricity networks, etc. He also started to take the care of the weakest groups in society more seriously, mainly by arranging stuff like housing, jobs, healthcare, schools, and so on. We also got vacation here in Sweden for the first time, 2 weeks paid vacation every year. But yeah, we had a huge problem here in Sweden with anti-Semitism. In 1937, kosher slaughter was banned. Many Swedish companies also fired Jews in order to continue trading with Germany. Jewish doctors were not allowed to work in Stockholm's hospitals, etc. In the early 1900s here in Sweden, we had a huge race research facility and institute in a town called Uppsala. This was the first institute in the world, and they often collaborated with German researchers. They mapped many groups here in Sweden, such as Jews, Romani, Sami, and others. Skulls were measured, records were kept, and so on. In the 1930s, the state started to cooperate with SAF, the employers' union. For example, we have the so-called Salt Lake Bath Arrangement in 1938. In 1939, when Adolf Hitler had become the leader of Germany, he started a great war, the so-called World War II. Basically, Germany declared war on neighboring countries such as Poland. Per Albin Hansson then made a speech to the Swedish population. It goes like this: Citizens, the terrible thing from which we at last hoped the world would be spared has occurred. A new great war has broken out. We have to state this horrible fact, and it serves little purpose in trying to express the sadness and horror we feel at the thought of what this has bring in terms of pain to an already wounded and tormented humanity. For us Swedes, it is now necessary to calmly and decisively gather together around the great task of keeping our country out of the war, to nurture and protect our inalienable national values, to be best master the stress of the evil times. He also declared that our preparedness is very good. And yeah, it wasn't. Sweden basically had almost no modern airplanes at this time and no tanks. We also had very few soldiers. Sweden therefore decided early in the war to become neutral, but during the war we would support both sides, both Germany in some ways and the Allies in other ways. For example, we mapped the Jews and Sami here in Sweden. We had a huge number of companies which sold iron ore to Germany, which was very necessary for their war industry. We also monitored the communists here in the country. We had transport bans for communists, and we also shut down anti-Nazi newspapers. Few people here in Sweden know of the fact that during the Second World War, the Swedish police carried out a large number of raids between the year 1940 to 1942. They tried to arrest as many communists as possible. But we also helped Finland at the start of the war against Russia. We sent a bunch of volunteer soldiers, over 8,000, to Finland. We also sent different types of materials, mostly rifles, over 75,000, but also ammunition, hospital equipment, etc., and a small number of aircrafts. There were many posters here in Sweden during this time, which basically said, Finland's cause is also Sweden's cause. But yeah, more countries than Sweden helped, including Great Britain, France, and the United States. They also sent mostly weapons and equipment. During the war between Finland and Russia, we have the so-called bombing of Pajala, which took place on February 21, 1940, when a group of Soviet bombers misnavigated and dropped their bombs over what they thought was Rovaniemi in Finland. No one died or was seriously injured, but several buildings were destroyed, and in the summer of 1940 the Soviets started to pay compensation to Sweden. But then Norway and Denmark was invaded by Germany. The reason for this was mostly the fact that Germany had to protect the Swedish transport system of iron ore and ball bearings to Germany. During the year 1942 to 1943, 80% of Sweden's foreign trade was with Germany. So we were basically essential for the German war industry, otherwise they would have broken down really fast. But during the time that Finland, Norway and Denmark was attacked, Sweden started to mobilize the army. On April 11, 1940, the general mobilization here in Sweden began secretly, because we didn't want to provoke Germany, of course. So the number of men under arms was raised in a few weeks from about 60,000 to 320,000. We also got a lack of supplies here in Sweden during this time. Therefore, the rationing began. The first rationing here in Sweden of food came into effect in March 1940. First, it was for coffee and tea. Sugar was then rationed in April the same year, and then stuff like petrol, firewood, etc. also was rationed in quick succession, of course. The last commodity to be rationed was salt, and that happened in 1945. In 1941, we have the so-called midsummer crisis here in Sweden. During this time, we received a request from Germany. They wanted to send soldiers through Sweden, the so-called Engelbrekt division. This caused a political crisis here in Sweden because some of our politicians wanted to agree to these demands, while other politicians wanted to say no. The result was that after there had some debates, they agreed on Germany's demands. So 2 million German soldiers were allowed to pass through Swedish territory, mostly by rail, during the period of June 1940 to August 1943. This was a clear violation of the Hague Convention. So basically, Sweden was not neutral. What would have happened otherwise, you might ask? Well, if Sweden hadn't accepted these arrangements and terms from Germany, Germany would have invaded Sweden and taken Sweden relatively easily, considering the fact that we didn't have many airplanes, we didn't have many tanks during this time, and the Swedish defenses hadn't been as good as we might had hoped for. During World War II, we have a person here in Sweden who is really interesting. His name is Arne Bjurling, and he succeeded in cracking the German so-called Enigma code. After he had broken the code, he started to send text messages to both Britain but also the Soviet Union to better prepare them for the war. But the war turned. Germany in 1942 suffered some defeats, mostly in Soviet, but also against allies in other places. So Sweden then began to switch sides by increasingly helping the Allies instead of Germany. Among other things, Sweden helped the Norwegian guerrilla groups and resistance fighters. They were now allowed to use Sweden as a base for their operations. This enabled them to blow up Hitler's factory that were used in Norway to produce so-called heavy water, which is necessary to make nuclear weapons. Before 1942, Sweden only allowed 3,000 Jewish immigrants. Here in Sweden, the politicians believed that too many Jews would lead to increased anti-Semitism and a greater threat of war, considering the fact that Germany at this time was winning the war. But after 1942, when the Germans started to lose, we allowed tens of thousands of Norwegians, Finns, and Jews to come to Sweden. 30,000 people came from countries such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And during 1943, for example, Sweden took in almost all of Denmark's 8,000 Jews. Here in Sweden during this time, we have an interesting person called Raoul Wallenberg. He saved thousands of Hungarian Jews, maybe even as many as 100,000 by giving them Swedish protection passports. We also now allowed other countries to use Sweden as a base for training their soldiers. A total of 13,000 Norwegian soldiers were trained here in Sweden. At the end of the war, a Danish brigade of 3,600 was also set up. Here in Sweden, people now agree that we must help the Jews as much as possible. Therefore, they created a program here in Sweden named the White Buses, and they saved between 15,000 to 30,000 Jews from various concentration camps at the end of the war. But yeah, Sweden escaped the war mostly unharmed. The industry here in Sweden was complete and intact, and therefore they were then enabled to sell a lot of things, mostly to other European countries, Germany, France, Great Britain, etc., because they now needed to rebuild their cities and industries. So this created a bunch of new industries here in Sweden. such as Electrolux, Ericsson, Alfa Laval, Volvo and Saab. So it began a new period here in Sweden, which was called the Golden Years. They lasted from 1945 to 1970. But during this time, Sweden's GDP rose by almost 10% every year. The only country in the world that had the same good development as Sweden was Japan. So the industry here in Sweden had a really good time during these years. Therefore, Sweden had to import labor from other countries. Mostly countries such as Turkey, Greece, the Balkan countries, Yugoslavia, Romania, etc. The Social Democrats, they ruled Sweden during this time as well, and they started to build houses for every person here in Sweden. They created a program called the Million Program, which was a program to create houses for as many as 1 million people. Therefore, the name the Million Program. They also introduced child allowance, extra help for new mothers, etc., in order to make the people have more children and babies. And the television became a thing here in Sweden. Sweden never joined NATO. Instead, we helped Great Britain and the United States to spy on the Soviet Union after World War II. We still do this today. Because Sweden started to spy on the Soviet Union started to send spies here to Sweden. The most famous spy here in Sweden from the Soviet side was Stig Wernerström. He sent thousands of secret Swedish documents to Soviet Union, but was then caught in the year 1963. Sweden during this time also tried to acquire nuclear weapons. First we tried to create our own nuclear weapons, but we didn't get as much plutonium as we had hoped for. We therefore tried instead to buy them from the United States, but they said no. So I hope that you during this lecture have gained some new knowledge about Sweden's history. The sources I have used for this video are a book called History by Elisabeth Ivansson, Robert Sandberg and Mattias Tudaj, Perspective on History by Lars Hans and Örjan Nyström, Traitors by Anders Franksson, Sweden during the Second World War by Anders Franksson, history documentary, Sweden's History by Martin Timell and Dick Harrison, Wikipedia, Sweden during the Second World War, Aron Flam, Part 1, Sweden and Nazi Germany Hotspot on YouTube, and a book called The Labor Market by Anders Björklund. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. I hope that you liked this video, but have a good day. Bye.